Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food. And I do this by sharing exactly what's been going on in my own allotment and my own garden. Now this week's episode is centering around tools. Be it a lawnmower down on the allotment, our tools that are in restoration here at home, and how we're storing our tools in our shed. So, without much ado, come meet me down the allotment and we will get this week's podcast underway. Well, I'm down on the allotment and I have just spent the last couple of hours purely cutting the grass here on the allotment. Up until a couple of weeks ago, it's been so wet down on the allotment that cutting the grass has been almost impossible. Reason I say that is I have battery-powered garden tools these days. I used to use petrol, and petrol was much better at dealing with wet, long grass. But I find that battery-powered lawnmowers in particular, they do tend to mulch up in that the grass sticks together and blocks the blades from turning efficiently and causes a bit of stress on the lawnmower. So it does make it very, very difficult to cut the grass, particularly here on the allotment, because the grass here is incredibly thick. Now, I will still continue to use battery-powered tools. Overall, I do much prefer battery-powered tools than petrol-powered tools. In general, anyway, but there are just some things that I think petrol-powered tools are a little bit better at dealing with, and long grass is one of those. Anyway, as I was cutting the grass with a lawnmower, of course we get grass clippings, and you know, I love to use grass clippings as a bit of a mulch. Composting is the other option with them, but I find as a mulch it works very, very well. And I decided that it was time to mulch my garlic with these grass clippings. My garlic is actually growing really, really well. We've got some good signs of growth. Most of the varieties are up and germinated, so it looks like we're going to get some decent garlic. The downside, however, the garlic fertiliser that I wanted to pot on before I pot the mulch on was in my shed. And my shed, this is the big shed, I've got two sheds on the allotment. The big shed, just a complete and utter mess. I've just thrown stuff in there over this last year, maybe even 2 years thinking about it, just out of convenience and anything. My little shed that I have on the other half of the allotment is generally what I use for storing on my tools, and that one is fairly tidy, but this big shed just became a bit of a dumping ground. So in order to get my garlic fertiliser, I had to clear out some of the junk out of this shed. So I went through it, I got a dustbin liner, and I just removed anything that was broken, not worth keeping, has been thrown away. Now, I hate throwing anything away. I believe everything has a second use, but sometimes there has to be a bit of a compromise. Anything broken, anything like that, just not going to be used, went in the bin. There was of course a lot of cardboard as well, which I've thrown in my compost bins in order to help with that process as well. All going towards making good compost and making the allotment a little bit more efficient. Now, I have placed cardboard, of course, over some of my beds that are used for broad beans and for field beans. So other than those three beds, my other beds, I all have something growing in it, be it green manures or produce. So there was no point putting any cardboard down on that. Using it on the compost bin was the next best thing. Anyway, tidied the shed up, cut the grass, and I fed and mulched my garlic. And that is leading us to get some good quality garlic. Hopefully, anyway, we'll find out next year. One of the things I noticed when I was clearing out my shed, however, is tools. Now, as I said, my little shed is where I keep most of my tools. But what I realised, the tools in there are my tools that I use most, the tools that I use every day. What I discovered in this big shed is tools that I basically had forgotten I had because they've never came up. Tools like different types of hose or my potato fork, and tools that have a very specific use, but I've realised I don't use them. I think when it comes to tools, there's only a certain amount of tools that we really use. My double-edged hoe, my spade, my fork, my trowel, maybe a few other pruners and trimmers and things like that, but a lot of these other tools I don't use. So I'm not going to throw those away, of course. I might keep them down here for the occasional use, but I'm thinking, do I really need them? I'm going to pose this question to you. Do you have tools that you don't really need or you don't really use? Do you hoard them and think they will come in use? It's certainly a case of mine. Now, a few years ago, I had a bit of an affinity with some of the more old-fashioned or unknown tools, such as a potato fork or a beetroot fork or things like that. And again, I come back to the fact that all they've done is sit in a shed, taken up space, not being used. So what do I do with them? That I don't know. That's a question I'm going to have to ask myself. What I am, however, doing is I've collected every single tool I have on this allotment and I'm taking them all home with me. And the reason I'm taking them home is because it's that time of year where I like to give all my tools a good service, and that's something that we do at home. So we're going to head on home now, and I'm going to meet you back in my garden shed where we're going to take a bit of time and care to treat and care for our tools for this next year. Well, I'm just going to interrupt this podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, then please rate and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds to leave a rating and review, but it means the world to us and it helps us get found by more people who might be looking into growing their own food. Not only that, if you are enjoying this podcast, then please consider becoming a member of our Supporters Club. Our Supporters Club is set up to help keep the wheels on this podcast running. Trust me, there's a lot of work that goes into it. I charge just £5 a month to be a member, but for that £5 a month, you get access to extra behind-the-scenes podcasts, as well as a collection of seeds sent to your door on a monthly basis. And these seeds are curated to be sown in that very month. Along with the seeds, you also get a copy of our monthly mini newspaper, which just gives a bit of information on how to sow the seeds, as well as a few ideas of other tasks that you could be doing throughout that month. Now, over this last week, we've actually been sowing a couple of seeds. We have sown some peas. These are an overwintering variety that'll be, well, we've sown them directly outside here at home, but they're going to provide us with some early peas next year. We have also sown cress, a microgreen. Now, microgreens may not be for everyone, but at this time of year, we really want to capitalise on any bit of growing space, and cress is just fantastic to grow on a windowsill. Now, if that sounds something you would like to get involved with, then head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to find out more and sign up. I'd love to have you there. Right, let's get back to the gardening. Well, I'm back home now and I've brought all my tools from the allotment and my tools from here at home into my workshop shed. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you will know that about once a year, I like to give all my garden tools a good maintenance check over. And that's what I've been doing this week. So what I've been basically doing, and I'm going to do an example while I talk to you, is I bring all my garden tools into this shed. I start off with a very good clean. This is my lawnmowers, my chainsaws, my spades, my forks, and everything like that. Now, luckily, one of the tips that I do share with people is, in order to keep my tools in good condition, when I finish using my tools, in both my sheds here at home and on the allotment, I have a bucket in which I filled up with some coarse sand and I've poured vegetable oil over that. Whenever I use my tools, before I pack them away, I always plunge my tool into this bucket of sand. Let's say we're using a hoe, for example, the end that comes in contact with the ground that we do the hoeing with, I plunge that into the bucket of sand. The sand acts as an abrasive, so it clears away any mud that might be on the tool itself. It also acts as an abrasive to keep my tools sharp. Not 100% sharp, it still needs the odd sharpening while using the hoe, but it does help keep them sharp. But the main thing that I like to do with this is that it also oils the tools as well, because of that vegetable oil that we've poured in here. And that generally keeps my tools in a pretty good condition. As I said, we do about once a year need to then just think about giving them a bit of maintenance. So I start off with a good clean, and that doesn't take me too long. Just with a wire brush, we just clear away any remaining mud that might be on there. It doesn't take long at all. And once it's cleaned, we just want to make sure there's no bits of rust or anything that needs a bit of care as well. Luckily, my tools are in pretty good condition. Now, most of my tools, hand tools anyway, will have a wooden handle or shaft, because that's how I prefer them. I think they feel nicer in the hand and they're easier to use. But some of my tools are metal. Either way, what I like to do is just, again, give the handles a bit of a check over. Wooden tools, we can give them a bit of a sand as well, just to make sure they're a bit smoother and easier to handle. Again, I'm checking for any bits of rust or anything like that, because all we're going to do then is just give that a bit of a clean off. Now, with my lawnmowers and other tools like that, we obviously just worry about giving it a good clean and making sure the blades are sharp. Which brings me up to the next point, which is sharpening of the tools. Now, this is a very important job. A sharp tool is safer than a blunt tool. It's easier to use, it does the job much better, and it gets more efficient. So we want to sharpen our tools that need sharpening. Mower blades, hoes, and even spades, because a spade does have a blade on it, all benefit from a bit of a sharpen. So what I do for this, I've set up my bench grinder. I have to put it at the right angle depending on what the tool is. And how I set the angle up is I look at what we've got and I try and match that with the angle on the bench grinder. Very simple to do, but it's hard to describe. I just simply set it up to match the blade. Once it's set up, of course, remove the tool, and we're going to turn on the bench grinder like so, and then we just run the blade there we go. Doesn't take long at all. Right, there we go. We've got this hoe now sharp, and that's going to be good for a lot of hoeing. So we've done the cleaning stage. We've sharpened up the hoe. We've cleared away any rust. We've sanded the handle. What we're going to do next is just make sure everything's in good condition as well, actually. Make sure that any screws or anything that holds anything in place is tight. Again, not too much of a problem for me, because I try and do that as we go along. But again, it's just worth a check, making sure that's done. And any that do need tightening up, of course, we're just going to tighten those up. we've got a little screw here. I'm just going to, yeah, that's nice and tight, so that's okay. So moving on to the next stage now is what I like to do is, with the wooden handles, oil the handles. They last so much longer. Last year, I didn't do it with one of my hoes. And what happens with wood, particularly when wood dries out or becomes less supple, it becomes brittle and easy to break. So I used to use linseed oil a lot, or flaxseed oil as it's also known. And I would put that onto these wooden handles, let it soak in until the wood couldn't take any more. But what I tend to use now is derived from sheep's wool. It's like a linolene. I'm finding that to be much, much better. Plus it's supporting UK farmers, which is something I do like to do. And all I do, I just soak that into the wooden handles until it doesn't take any more. Wipe off any excess and then hang it up to dry. Then after that, what I will then do is the metal part of any tool, give it a bit of a paint as well, just with some black hammerite paint. Obviously not the blade that we've just sharpened, we're going to avoid that, but the rest of it, definitely try and give that a good paint just to stop that from rusting in the future as well. It effectively means that your garden tool will look like brand new. But what this does, it looks after the tools, which means they're going to last us much, much longer. They're less likely to break when we need them, and they look great as well. Give the tools some love. Now, if you haven't done that already, this is something I highly recommend that you do around this time of year. Come out every night into your shed and just tend to one of your tools and get them looking nice and good. Now, this is a general thing that I do with all tools. The only difference might be things like secateurs or cutting tools, because although everything I've just said we pretty much do the same with, I do find it's easier to take those apart if we can take them apart in order to give them a bit of maintenance. So you sometimes need a couple of spanners on either side, maybe something different depending on what your tool is. But when you do take them apart, they do have springs in them and things like that. So it's worth just being careful to not lose all the springs. Now, I would say if you are unsure, don't know what you're doing, then don't take your tool apart. But still give it a bit of love. Still give it a bit of care. It will provide you back in such easier work over this winter period. Now, as I said earlier, when I do finish with using my tools out in the garden, I do plunge them in my sand bucket and coat them in oil, which does help. But another thing I also do is I have a tiny little file with me when I'm using my tools, particularly hoeing. And after every couple of minutes, I like to just sharpen up my blade as I'm using it, just to keep that blade on a hoe, spade, whatever it may be, sharp. As I said earlier, a sharp bladed tool is safer than a blunt tool. You have to use less pressure, it does a better job, and I really cannot emphasize just how important it is to keep tools sharp. Right, I'm going to meet you back in my other shed, my main shed, in just a moment. In the meantime, let's find out what Chef Scott has for us this week.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef Scott with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe. And this week we have the Seed of the Month recipe. And as you will know, Richard chose a selection of herbs. Now, I love to grow herbs, as I believe they should be used in abundance. But they are not cheap in the supermarkets. I checked in my local supermarket and it was £1 for 20 grams of chives. So it makes sense to grow our own, especially considering they will grow back every year. And used in abundance in this week's recipe, they are delicious. And it is a celery, potato, chive and sour cream soup, served with a poached egg and crispy Parma ham. So let's head to the kitchen and hear how it's made. As usual, you can find this recipe and others on the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk or on my Instagram page, Seed to Table Plot 13. This recipe serves 4 people and you will need 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 diced onion, 300 grams of diced celery, 1 chopped clove of garlic, 200 grams of peeled and diced potatoes, 100 grams of chopped chives, 500 millilitres of vegetable stock, 1 tablespoon of sour cream, 4 slices of cooked crispy Parma ham, and 4 poached eggs. Method: start by sweating off the onion, garlic and celery in the butter in a medium-sized saucepan for a few minutes. Then add the potatoes, stock and chives and bring to a boil. Then turn down to a simmer and cover with a lid. And cook for 20 minutes until the potatoes are breaking apart and the celery is tender. Now add the sour cream and season with salt and pepper and blitz with a stick blender or in a food processor. You may need to add a little water if it's too thick. Serve in a bowl with a poached egg and Parma ham. And that's the recipe done, and that's it from me this week.
Well, I'm in my main gardening shed here at home now. Now, I've got 3 sheds here at home. I've got the workshop that I was just in, which I call my workshop. It's where I keep a lot of my heavy-duty tools for woodworking and work and things like that. I do enjoy a bit of woodwork from time to time. I've also got this shed, which is a shed I built from scratch, and I absolutely love this shed. It's a good size shed, 8 foot by 8 foot, built to my own specifications, although the hardboard in here is starting to really not look great. That was one of the things I wish I never did, so we're going to have to look at taking this hardboard out. But I've come in here for a very good reason. This shed is meant to be the shed that I do a lot of tidying and working in, and it does work quite well for that. I've got a couple of benches set up for seed sowing. I've got kitchen worktops underneath where I keep storage for things. I've got some IKEA recycling bins for keeping compost and things like that in. But one of the problems is, as we go throughout the year, we start off with a nice tidy shed, but it soon gets very, very full with junk. I get sent quite a few things to try. We've got some olive tree plant food and urban worm castings, as well as lava light hydrogrow items and things like that as well, all of which we're going to be using and talking about. So the main thing that I'm trying to do in here is get everything organised. And it started with my tools. As I said just now, we've been going through our tools, servicing and repairing and restoring and making sure they're good for the next season. But what I like to do as well, as I'm going through my tools, I'm working out if I really need to keep all the tools that I have, just like I had down on the allotment. What I'm doing now is, if I haven't used a tool in the last year, then I'm probably not going to need it. So like we do with wardrobes, anything that I haven't worn in the last year gets donated to charity. So a lot of these tools are probably going to go to our community garden that I don't need. And that's just going to free up a bit of space. I'm also, what I like to do with my tools particularly, is I like to have tools hanging on the wall. It makes them easy to get hold of when I need them. It also makes it easy to see if any are missing. It doesn't take long just to have a quick visual and check everything's in place. In the past, I just used to use hooks and just hanged them up inside my sheds. What I have in here, though, when I built this shed, this was one thing I really, really wanted, was some pegboards from IKEA. And they've actually done quite well. I went for pegboards because sometimes, as we all do it, we change our tools around or it doesn't quite suit. And when we've got things that are rigid, like hooks that are screwed into place, it's very difficult to change things around. With a pegboard, it's so much easier just to adjust things and change things around. So that's one of the reasons I like pegboards, and it gives us lots of different options of what we can do. And the pegboard has worked quite well. They are starting to get a little bit bent in here, if I'm honest with you. I think these are made from MDF, these ones from IKEA. And being in a damp environment out here in the shed, I think they're starting to warp. So we might have to look at changing those to something a little bit better in the future. This is one of the great things about sometimes just having to tidy up and organise. You get the chance to assess things that we want to change. Now, moving on from that, as I said, this entire shed, we are having a bit of a tidy and organise up in here. We've got recycling bins for compost, which works quite well. We've also got a lot of feeds and fertilisers, which are all in their individual containers and all labelled up. And as I'm organising through it, I can see anything that needs replenishing. So if I'm low on, say, garden lime, at the moment garden centres do seem to be having some sales on, so we can pop down to a garden centre and get some bargains and save some money and replenish what we're going to need. Now again, the downside of this is something I was trying to work out is, do we really use all these feeds and fertilisers or anything like that? So sticking with that same rule, if I haven't used it in the last year, probably won't need it again. So we're going with that same rule, just to free up some space and make a bit more room in this shed. Now, this is going to be very important over the coming weeks because I have a plan. I'm hoping it's all going to come together. It may not, but I have a plan because my third shed, which is where I keep my lawnmowers and a lot of items that we don't use that much, shall we say, they're the big bulky garden items, I guess you could say. Well, that shed is going. I'm going back to having a potting shed for sowing seeds. I used to have one here many years ago before I built this shed, which I took down because it was quite ugly looking. It used the corrugated iron that I have built beds on the allotment with, but it had windows all along the front, and it worked really well for sowing seeds, which is one of the reasons I want to go back to it. But the downside is I need to empty that shed in order to demolish it. So I need this shed tidy, which we've been doing this week, in order to empty that shed and make sure everything in there that I want to keep can be stored nicely. Now, as we are getting on through into these darker nights, I think it is a great time to start to assess this. And perhaps you have some tools that you don't use or won't use, and perhaps you can look at that and think about donating those to your local charity. Right, I think it is time now to head back into the potting shed and find out what reviews we've got this week. Well, we're coming to the end of this week's podcast. And I always like to leave with the reviews that we get. And you take the time out to leave us a review. I think it's only right that I acknowledge the reviews. Plus, the thing I like about the reviews is it gives me some really useful feedback. Now, over on Spotify, Lynn says, "Hi Richard, your comment regarding nematodes and that they kill all slugs, not just the ones that damage crops, has really made me think whether to use them. But it was so demoralising this year and expensive because of the amount of wasted resources. I've really missed some crops too. No dwarf French beans this year, and repeated sowing of squash was never ended. Really undecided. Lynn." You know what, Lynn, this has been one of the problems that I'm having. It's been a very difficult year this year, and we all have struggled. We're all feeling demoralised. What I'm saying now is we got to look positive towards next year. Hence why I've been working towards making next year a much more productive year, regardless of what happens. And with regards to the slugs, I am going to be looking into other things that we can do. I always thought nematodes were safe, but somebody has pointed out the slight flaw in that plan. So it does throw quite a few problems our way when we think about how much we want to grow food, but don't really want to destroy nature at the same time. Now, I've also had a review on iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, sorry. I'm so old I still call it iTunes. This comes from Joanna, actually, on the back of episode 577. You may recall Joanna asked about her advice for the differences in what I grow to the Highlands of Scotland. I think a lot of people like that podcast, actually. And what Joanna says, "Thank you very much for this episode, Richard. Full of great advice for growing up here in the Highlands. Very much appreciated." Joanna, very welcome. As I said, I always love these reviews, and it's always good to get questions that I can make a podcast from. Helps me guide what you guys are thinking about. So thank you to Lynn, thank you to Joanne. That's got us a few ideas for the next few weeks. Now, moving on from that, of course, if you want to rate and review, then please do. It means the world to us, helps us get found by more people, and gives me that all-important feedback. Not only that, if you're enjoying this podcast, then please consider becoming a member of a supporters club. It really does help keep the wheels running on this podcast. If you want to get in touch, my email address is richard@theveggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can also contact me through the website, theveggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can leave a comment on the bottom of a blog post. You can email me from there. You can also leave us a voicemail, which is always good because we like to hear voices on this podcast. And finally, you can also find me on social media, where we are on pretty much every platform. We even have a Facebook group as well. Might change the name to the Veg Grower Podcast community on there. Well, with much ado, I'm going to get out of here. I will be back again next week with another podcast for you. So until then, please take care.